thank you so much, everyone, for such brilliant talks. And of course, please stay on tonight for our great DJ sets. We'll have 3 different DJs tonight, so it's going to be an absolute treat. So kind of to close us off, we have an excellent academic here, Louis Niebur. Louis Niebur is the interim department chair of theatre and dance and a professor of musicology at the University of Nevada, Reno. He received his PhD in musicology from the University of California, Los Angeles. His research areas include avant-garde and popular music of the post-war era, including music in radio, television, and film, and the significance of music to LGBTQ+ communities as it has shifted between live music, the jukebox, and the disc jockey in the context of queer spaces. He has delivered and published papers on such topics as San Francisco's proto-queercore and post-disco scenes, the history of camp records and other gay recording labels of the 1960s, electronic television and radio music and sound in Britain, the role of women in early electronic music studios, and the queer function of electronic sound production in electronic dance music. His book, Special Sound, The Creation and Legacy of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, was the first monograph to situate the BBC's electronic studio within the context of popular music. His most recent book, Menergy, San Francisco's Gay Disco Sound, which is incredible, I fully recommend you go buy it, traces the way disco and high-energy dance music channeled the spirit of gay liberation through a shared dance floor experience. Over to you, Louis.
Thank you so much. First of all, this conference has been amazing. Thank you so much, Christine and Will. I feel like pretty much everything I'm about to say has already been said, or at least has been invoked in interesting ways already. So I've found so many great connections, and it's been wonderful to meet so many fantastic people. So this talk is somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour, depending on how long the musical examples take. I always like to know what we're in for. So also in musicology, we do the weird thing of reading papers, which seems a little alien to some other fields. So that's what I'll be doing. I'll be reading the paper. All right. The disco backlash began long before that July night in Chicago, when mostly young, white, working class people trashed the field of Comiskey Park. That evening's events were merely the culmination of an ever-increasing antipathy towards many musical and cultural shifts perceived in American culture by many disparate groups. While it's the straight white male rocker that gets the most of the blame now, the truth is more complicated, and a diverse group of people had a whole host of reasons for hating the genre. Some listeners, particularly those who had grown up with the countercultural urban folk revolution, surely associated disco with the notion that Black music is fun, but not meant to be taken seriously like rock. We also shouldn't dismiss the racist and homophobic aspects of the Disco Sucks movement. Moving my frame forward. Is anything happening up there?
No.
Will. For the first time in history, people of color, women, and gays held positions of influence and power up and down the recording industry. As gay record producer Mel Sharon observed, it was like musical monopoly and gay people ran the bank. But, next slide. There we go. Can you see it? Oh, we're seeing the viewer, there's their view. But rock musician Ted Nugent's overt homophobia was not merely a critique of the music and industry itself, but also the raison d'etre of disco, dancing. Nothing could strike terror in the hearts of young straight boys like dancing. But if you wanted to meet girls in the late 70s, you had to go where they were, and that meant dancing to disco, permanently damaging your reputation as a macho man. To them, hatred of disco was merely a projection of their own insecurity and a dismissal. Thank you. Dancing, boys dancing. It was a dismissal of their own security and a dismissal of Hollywood culture's attempt to persuade them that you can be hyper masculine and still love to dance, like Saturday Night Fever's Tony Manero.
We just wash the hair. You know, I work on my hair a long time, and you hit it. He hits my hair.
They resented disco's perceived inauthenticity through overly polished orchestrations that reveled in the blatant commercialism of ideas of luxury, the overwhelming vanity and confidence of the straight male disco dancer. They hoped to be free of what Disco Demolition Night organizer Steve Dahl memorably called, quote, the tyranny of sophistication. To many young audiences disillusioned with the mainstream takeover of music by disco, punk captured their angst and nihilism, particularly those who felt excluded from the utopian worldview disco often presented. Club owner Joe Shanahan remembered how fresh the emerging punk scene of Chicago in 1979 seemed to him, where, quote, the black and white was blurred, the gay straight line was blurred too. La Mer Vipere was a gay club that did a punk rock night, which then became a punk rock club. Chicago DJ Joe Brill recalls at that time among rock fans, quote, there was a rigidity as to what was acceptable music. It took me a minute to transcend my own qualms. None of my friends would go with me to punk rock bars in the late 1970s. And that was my first exposure to gay culture in Chicago, seeing a group of drag queens walk into La Mer Vipere. A similar oppositional stance against disco was articulated by proponents of funk. One of the critiques of disco from a funk perspective was that disco, white, gay, merely simulated the feelings expressed authentically by true folk artists, or funk artists, black and straight. Funk historian Ricky Vincent, who we talked about earlier today, essentially said as much in his still definitive monograph on the subject. Quote, this new sound provided a dance experience with easy to learn steps taught at clean clubs, typically managed by gays and white ethnics. I can't be the only one who instantly thought of Kim Woodburn.
That is smashing. Watch, my love. What do you think of that, my dear?
For Vincent, quote, black music in general became less soulful, more mechanical, and less meaningful, whilst the ideals of disco were to dance interminably to monorhythmic beats, the ideals of funk were to get off your ass and jam, unquote. There's a lot to unpack here, especially as Vincent goes on to express his frustration that, quote, when pop music fans began to relish in the chant disco sucks, a subtle racial classification brought together all of black dance music, despite the fact that late 70s funk bands had declared war on disco too. So what I want to talk about in today's keynote speech are the loose threads of the late 70s. What strange bedfellows, gay, straight, black, Latin, white, were created in the wake of disco's domination of the US music charts. How did artists and audiences manifest their antipathy, their fears, their oftentimes secret love of the genre, both during its heyday and its aftermath? I'm particularly interested in how gay people responded to these changes, and most of my examples will come from San Francisco, probably the center of gay life in the 1970s. I might be a little biased, but historiographically, this talk will be less about constructing a convincing narrative of disco's aftermath. We've had plenty of those already this weekend that have been wonderful, but leaning into the ambiguities of the existing stories we tell ourselves about the death of disco. In the wake of the so-called death of disco in the gay enclave of the Castro district in San Francisco, enterprising DJs, record producers, and musicians started their own small dance music record labels to make up for the lack of new danceable music. These independent labels' music did more than copy what the larger industry had been doing, however. Instead, the upstart companies built upon the musical experiments their roster of local producers and musicians, like Sylvester, Lisa, and Paul Parker, had been exploring over the last years, developing a distinctive style of their own. Known as high energy, this is not NRG, but actually the two words high energy, the music was perfected by producer Patrick Cowley in his own solo work and in collaborations with other San Francisco artists. It reveled in electronics, fast tempos, disco, and DJ culture, and above all, gay liberation as it had emerged over the previous decade in the Castro neighborhood. Throughout the 70s, San Francisco's Castro neighborhood had changed from predominantly working class families to a majority gay complex of so-called art fags, older assimilationist men and women in the professional classes, and the remnants of the counterculture, including the gender-fuck drag scene. But by far the largest population of gay men in the Castro came to be known as Castro Clones. Close-cropped hair, mustache, tight Levi 501s, white t-shirt underneath plaid flannel, leather jacket. The look was one of exaggerated masculinity. By the mid-1970s, the clone dominated the public perception of the gay community. Quote, machismo was no longer fashionable, it was ubiquitous, recalls Randy Shilts. Few hippies walked the streets anymore. The hair was kept closely cropped a la Korean War era. The dress was decidedly butch, as if God had dropped these men naked and commanded them to wear only straight-legged Levi's, plaid Pendleton shirts, and leather coats over hooded sweatshirts. The clone identity emerged in New York City and San Francisco at roughly the same time, and quickly spread to other large cities in the US and Europe, and could be broken down, according to clone historian Martin P. Levine, into the 4 Ds: disco, drugs, dish, and dick. So, here's a great cartoon from the time where 2 clones are speaking to each other entirely in disco song lyrics. I mean, this it encapsulates the world of the clones circa 1977. Disco, the music of choice for the clone, with a superficially icy distance aesthetic, a cleaned up, perfected sound, anonymized performers who aspired to be invisible and identity free, allowed macho clone dancers to construct intimate dance floor communities that positioned the collective as intensely unified but physically separate entities. To create this, gay disco embraced repetition to an extent never before heard in popular music. To create, and it's this profoundly new priority for repetition, I would argue, alienated many listeners who didn't understand how this music functioned very differently than the music that had come before it. Ricky Vincent, again, bemoaned this aspect of disco as another shortcoming of the genre. Formless disco tracks became the rage. These producer-made tunes generally lacked any sense of sequence, beginning, build-up, catharsis, release. What he's talking about is music with a sense of teleology. But anti-teleological music was hardly new. It was merely a building on a tendency that had been fomenting in both Black popular music and American art music since the 1960s. I'm going to break it down a little bit. So a drone, for example, has no forward motion, so no sense of beginning, build up, catharsis, release, as Vincent would say. It is free of teleology. Think of a steady sine tone or a stationary fan placed next to your bed. But in the 1960s, James Brown transformed R&B by allowing for a new kind of drone or anti-teleological music, one which was harmonically static, but in fact contained intense polyrhythmic variations. Brown, with drummer Melvin Parker, hinted at this a year before Papa's Got a Brand New Bag made the world familiar with his new polyrhythmic one-chord technique, where everything repeats after 8 bars, in this case, 24 times, the same repeated phrase. Watching James Brown. I had to find a place to stop. I mean, we couldn't play the whole thing. But whereas funk moved away from this tendency in the mid-1970s, shifting the emphasis onto the one, but with more traditional song structures, disco leaned heavily into it, moving away from funk and into pure groove. Salsa Orchestra expressed it perfectly in 1976 in their song, "It Don't Have to Be Funky to Be a Groove." In fact, that's what disco reveled in, grooves that on the surface appear static.
It don't have to be funky to be a groove, yeah.
The first big disco response to James Brown's polyrhythmic declaration was undoubtedly MFSB's Love is the Message, the second half of Love is the Message, which captures music critic Tim Page's definition of, quote, a drone that is not a drone, an active, abundant, richly fertile stasis. Think about the disco ball. While it initially just seems to go in circles forever, the joy is found in the impossibly complex interactions of light hitting the individual mirrors and reflecting on walls, floors, and dancers' bodies. In Philip Glass's Music in 12 Parts from 1974, what you initially hear as repetition quickly becomes polyrhythmic variety. For 25 minutes in this movement, listeners are held in a trance of shifting textures, all on the same two alternating notes as in Love is the Message, the leading tone and tonic. So you get a so it's like a resolution. Think of Love is the Message. That's exactly what Philip Glass does here. Go back down. And again, it's 25 minutes long. I hear this in the break of the original's disco classic Down to Lovetown, the exact same phenomenon. This is the part of the song that matters. This is the part dancers wait for. While it seems like nothing is happening for 22 repetitions of the same bars, the separate polyrhythmic elements are all creating tiny, wonderful variations. The improvising bongos mirroring the unplanned dancing on the floor as the groove takes over our bodies. I never want this part of the song to end. When it comes on, I was like, when the vocals are done, I'm like, you don't need the vocals anymore. You just want the groove. Especially when that Clavinova or whatever this comes in, you're like, oh, good. Again, I had to stop it somewhere. It goes on. What we're really talking about is the difference between truly non-teleological music and music that incorporates elements of rhythmic teleology, adding elements and gradually breaking them down, manipulating them like modular objects. I love a schematic. Let's look more closely at one track, Cojack, from 1978 by John Davis and the Monster Orchestra. How anyone could hear this music and think it was simple is just beyond me. We'll be listening to the first half of the break, the sort of bold part, starting at the 1 minute and 15 seconds. The fact that the meat of the song, the traditional elements of new musical materials are gotten through in just over a minute says something about the priorities of the song. It's the groove and not the tune, and not the words, not the tune, but the polyrhythmic patterns that matter. So we're starting at 1:15 here. forever. Everyone, thank you. Great new idea coming up. Okay, I had to stop there. It's amazing. It's someone who understands that the break is the song. You know, this is the point of the music. What's been missing so far from this discussion is the euphoric nature of so-called anti-teleological music. While the beat keeps us grounded to the dance floor, the repetition creates the headspace for transportation, what in religious contexts might be called ecstasy. This was a connection formed in some gay communities for people who had frequently left both their birth families and birth religions for the found families of new urban gay centers such as the Castro. Here, clone culture held sway, the nightclub, the church, and disco, the hymn book. On March 11, 1979, San Francisco local gay disco superstar Sylvester performed a concert at the San Francisco War Memorial Opera House. For a city still in mourning over the assassination of Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk, Sylvester seemed uniquely equipped to provide the kind of church service the community needed. Over 3,000 people dressed for the occasion, whether in tuxedos and formal dresses or assless chaps and feather boas. Sylvester later remarked that, quote, "I suppose everyone's dream fantasy for living your life the way you want is to go to the opera." The sold-out show featured an 8-piece band enhanced with a 20-piece orchestra featuring musicians from the San Francisco Symphony. Sylvester's backup singers, Martha Wash and Izora Rhodes, known as 2 Tons of Fun, soon to become the Weather Girls, were supplemented by the addition of 2 gospel singers and arrangers. By the time Sylvester reached the peak of the show, he explicitly evoked that feeling of church through hypnotic repetition. Tempos had been rising throughout the night, peaking at a frantic 144 beats per minute, and the crowd had been driven to ecstasy when his hit, Dance Disco Heat, began. Over the repeated invocations to dance by the singers, Eric Robinson's gospel piano solo pushed the spirit even higher, and when the singers started wailing at the top of their lungs, and the clapping shifted from a simple backbeat to 8 beats a measure, so from to this, Sylvester realized things were different. Quote, "I don't know what happened, but the whole thing changed, and we had service. You may not understand this," Sylvester cried out into the audience, "but tonight is Sunday night. You know it is. And that's why we carry on like we know, because tonight is Sunday night. Sounds good to me." The whole thing is held together by synthesizer player Patrick Cowley's rapid, repeating one-note drone, but it's never static.
Sounds all right to me, y'all. Wait. I'm gonna let Eric play for you a little bit.
let me ever have to stop any of these examples. I'm sorry. Singer Martha Wash knew something special was happening on the stage, something essential for the city's healing, bridging whatever gap that existed between gospel and disco. Quote, while we were singing, listening to the roar of those people and their approval, it's like a spirit when you connect. Everybody's thinking along the same lines and it's explosive. They're feeding us, we're feeding them. We had this eruption of kindred souls. That night at the Opera House, Sylvester and disco music provided the kind of release and collective catharsis people often seek through religion. The San Francisco sound also embraced electronics to an extent that mirrored the developments of Eurodisco. I almost said Eurovision. Artists like Giorgio Moroder's, Cerrone, and Alec Costantino's, but the use in an explicitly queer context was slightly different than the very heterosexual, if still quite camp, songs of those earlier artists. In a set that survives from May 1st, 1977, DJ Bobby Vitoriti changes from Space's Tango in Space to Donna Summer's I Feel Love, which had just officially been released that day. Working with 2 copies of the Summer record, just as the song reaches the final long instrumental section, he phases 2 copies of the record, creating an artificial stasis that counteracts the built-in stereo panning of the production. One is left with the feeling of disorientation, with the pulsating effect of a drone combined with synthesized sensuality. That's what it sounds like in my head. Like this is like this is the #1 song in heaven right there, I think. So to return to Ricky Vincent's critique of disco as anti-teleological, we can see that rather than anti-teleological, this new frozen in time disco style was just a different kind of teleology, one that reveled in the moment but still allowed for gradual shifts over extended periods of time. It's exactly this kind of queer teleology, and that's what we should call it because that's what it's associated with, that gay artists Jimmy Somerville and Richard Coles of the Communards evoked in their anthems to gay history, Never Can Say Goodbye and Don't Leave Me This Way in the mid-1980s. Here's one of the breaks from a mix of Don't Leave Me This Way from 1986, produced by Somerville, Coles and Mike Thorne, which with hindsight sounds like a combination of the Glass example and the originals example. almost identical to Love to Love You Baby. The strings are in reverse. I'll get a new counter melody against it. And for the hardcore dancers, the part of the song that you live for. You know the chorus is going to come back. And you're praying it's going to come back, and then you're hoping it won't come back, and you're just dancing and you're sort of building and building. So I'd like to shift gears now, since this aspect of disco was antithetical to the surface rewards of, say, punk, which ironically were perceived as deep by gay music critics in the 1970s. When the gay press reported on punk, it was effusive. As with the straight music press, gay music critics were largely white, middle-class men falling all over themselves to praise the emergence of punk. For example, the Gay Alternates music critic declared 1977 the year of the punk rocker, saying the genre has given pop music a much-needed shot of adrenaline, and divided the Record of the Year award between Fleetwood Mac's Rumors and the Ramones' Rocket to Russia. It's ironic that punk's most mainstream proponents were, if not openly antagonistic to the idea of gay rights, at least less public about its support of them. In the 1970s, there was no punk equivalent of Sylvester. So why did the gay music critics, so influential in the reception of embracing punk so wholeheartedly, so why did the music critics embrace punk so wholeheartedly right from the beginning? San Francisco's punk scene emerged with a substantial queer audience when Mabuhay Gardens, up until then a Filipino restaurant, you can see in the sign, began to book punk acts. Local bands were welcomed and they proliferated, as well as touring bands from across the country. The city's gay community center also started hosting punk dances in 1977, and gay bars and discos such as the Stud and I-Beam had live punk bands perform throughout the late 1970s and 80s. The earliest proponent of punk in the gay community was journalist Howie Klein, and from the start positioned punk as an antidote to disco. In one of the first pieces published on the topic, Klein bemoaned the state of disco music in '76, a year when he felt, quote, tired formula cliches abounded, with one notable exception, Dr. Buzzard's Savannah Band, who, quote, probably extended the life of a very sick disco scene by half a year, unquote. From the beginning, Klein understood the problematic and nuanced relationship between establishment gay culture and punk artists, who on the one hand often embraced a look and style that seemed indebted to queerness, and on the other seemed loath to talk with the gay press. He noted how, on his recent West Coast tour, punk rocker Lou Reed refused to talk to the gay media, but, quote, didn't mind bringing the Rolling Stones' Tim Ferriss into his home for an interview, giving him an opportunity to write about Lou's live-in boyfriend Rachel in a way that the gay media would shun as exploitative, unquote. Some writers, like Mark Stowe, critic for the Atlanta-based Gabriel, praised punk and rock primarily because it challenged disco's hegemony, calling for a coverage of rock in the gay press. Quote, I've already had adverse reactions from cha-cha queens who feel that any article on any style of music other than disco doesn't belong in a gay magazine. I'm not saying that disco sucks or that it has been rammed down our throats, even though at times it seems so, but rather that there is so much more than disco that is not getting the attention which is so deserving. That gays hadn't embraced punk wholeheartedly was a surprise to openly gay Ramones manager Danny Fields, who in a 1977 interview with Howie Klein observed that disco is the music of the organized gay scene. If those people were true to their colors and their leather, you think they'd be into punk rock music, or at least the Ramones. Musically, it represents what they represent themselves as, stylistically. Brief, tough, efficient, hard, muscular, sexy, sort of brutal in an amyl nitrate-ish kind of instant head high way. But if you take off the leather and there's a ribbon clerk underneath, he likes Barry White, unquote. Sorry, I just had to squeeze in the Poppers t-shirt here at some point, and the fact that there's a Poppers brand called Disco Roma. It makes me so happy. Field's conflation of the sound of disco with effeminacy and clone culture with the leather scene caused Klein to challenge Fields and the Ramones to rethink their simplistic and racist reduction. Quote, here on the West Coast, gay men have a far more liberal attitude towards their music. And on the local punk rock scene, most of the musicians wear keys. So Ramones, don't be too surprised if you take off your leather when you're out here and find something other than a ribbon clerk. Klein saw in the music a philosophy that was shared between the two otherwise dissimilar groups, politics. Quote, gays are outsiders and so are the punks, he explained. In 1983, I think there's a propensity for gays to like new music because it's against the mainstream, and what's against the mainstream is good for them. In late 1978, Klein left the Bay Area Reporter to co-found 415 Records, one of San Francisco's first punk record labels. And Adam Block, who shared Klein's love of guitars and antipathy towards disco, took over. In his columns, he exclusively plugged rock and new wave and events in a gay context, such as Larry Lustig's Monday Night New Wave and Rock Nights at the Stud, of which he said, quote, aside from a come-lately team of loose cannon pogo destructo morons who occasionally monopolize the dance floor, the crowd is great. Women welcome. One notable concert was the Save the Homos New Wave Anti-Briggs benefit at Mapue Gardens, September 11th, 1978. Time and again, participants cited disco as both an example of the shallowness of gay life and a cause of gay apathy, particularly in light of the Anita Bryant Save Our Children movement, which sought through legislation known as the Briggs Initiative to fire gay and lesbian teachers and those who supported them. Quote, I want to strike a blow against hatred, Dennis Carr, gay lead singer for the local punk band Liars, said about the benefit concert. Quote, a lot of people aren't school teachers. They think that this is someone else's problem, so they just head on down to the disco and look for the next body. Disco for gays is a mirror image of the hetero disco scene, and it's not changing anything. There's no personal statement there, just fuck, fuck, fuck. That's not a solution. Block tried to reckon with and reconcile the contradictions in both disco and punk for gay audiences and found similarities between them. Disco was a revolt against the vapid arrogance of pop and its superstars in counterpoint to punk and new wave. Punk led a revolt into primitivism and anti-style. Disco was drunk with style at its most luxurious and chic. The anti-disco movement was anti-gay and racist in part, but it was also an attack on the edifice of artifice that the whole country was claiming as its own, and disco artists were as quick to disavow their gay following as the rockers had been. I don't know if I entirely agree with that, but in 1980, as we know, straight discos, for the most part, closed down or changed formats. The Los Angeles Times reported on the sorry state of the mainstream disco in April, quoting Jean LaPietra, gay co-owner of the popular Latin club Circus Disco. Quote, the gays are our big support. Discos that have a big gay clientele are much better off. They have a better future. Steve Forbes at Studio One Disco concurred. The drop in disco attendance is due to the straights dropping out. When they don't hear disco music or hear about discos as much on the radio or TV, or don't read about it as much anymore, they assume the disco thing isn't trendy anymore, so they lose interest. But gay discos in 1980 were bigger and better than ever, spurred on and altered by the influence of punk, post-punk, and new wave. DJs were playing a wider variety of music in their sets. Jim Farber traced the changes to early 1978, claiming Divine's show, The Neon Woman, at New York's Hurrah Disco, heralded the new disco rock genre, with that club starting a rock disco night soon after. The straight press started paying attention to the shift to rock clubs as early as 1979, when Billboard profiled the phenomenon. As the Los Angeles Times noticed, quote, the music isn't dead, but it has changed. It's been slowed down, blended with rock and other genres, and redubbed dance music. Probably the biggest change in discos is the music. It's not just those long rhythm and blues oriented 130 beats per minute numbers anymore. Anywhere from 10 to 40% is new wave or rock. Even in the local San Francisco gay press, it was admitted that, quote, the first bars to start playing rock music, new wave, reggae, and old Motown hits as an alternative to disco were gay bars. The change was felt all over gay America, where, for example, Lee James of Cruise Atlanta noted, quote, New wave music is rolling in at a rapid rate, drowning Donna and Barbara forever. Enough is enough already, girls. Old favorites are rocking in again with new sounds. Bette Midler turned rock star and looks pretty goddamn good doing it. DJ Chrysler remembers that when he began managing the disc jockeys at Castro Station in 1980, quote, no one really wanted to just play disco. They wanted to play Talking Heads, Ian Dury, and the Blockheads, Tom Tom Club. There was a lot of music that wasn't formula, or formula in a way that wasn't disco. There was a lot of music being made, and rhythm is not only native to a certain genre, but is native to a lot of genres. In 1983, Marty Bleckman considered the role gay clubs played in the popularization of a mainstream dance rock aesthetic. Quote, progressive dance rock is broken first in gay clubs. I think it's because gays go out all the time. They get tired of hearing the Human League 7 days a week, and they stop dancing to it a lot faster than a normal crowd would. To be programming in the gay community, you have to be on top of what's new. San Francisco's electronic sound and fast tempos had always faced comparison with Eurodisco. Giorgio Moroder had set the terms of electronic dance music in 1977, and Germany and Italy had been exploring the implications of his experiments ever since. But by 1981, the new dance music coming out of the United Kingdom started taking up a larger and larger portion of America's gay dance floors. Some critics noted the debt owed to San Francisco artists by this new bunch, like as when Billboard's Brian Chin called New Order's Blue Monday a, quote, dumbfoundingly successful takeoff of the Patrick Cowley cosmic disco sound, or when Dead or Alive's Mighty Mix was referred to as including, quote, megatone-style disco rocked and dubbed up. In the United Kingdom, some critics realized that the new sound coming out of their country wasn't exactly new. Record Mirror's James Hamilton lamented Cowley's 1982 death only a week after his 1978 remix of I Feel Love was finally made available in the United Kingdom, as it, quote, now is so much more excitingly instrumental that it's perfect again with today's electrophonic hits. While the reason for the rapid takeover of British electronic pop music on the US charts are complex, and we should read Robert's book. Robert, correct? Richard's book, which answers the complex question more than I certainly will ever begin to. The music's relationship to disco and punk worked to ingratiate these bands in a dance club culture eager to shed the stigma of disco. When Depeche Mode's first album, Speak and Spell, was released in the UK and the US in 1981, critics were divided, to say the least. For UK critic Paul Colbert, is he French? The connection to disco was clear, comparing them with Yellow Magic Orchestra in an overwhelmingly positive review, noting, quote, this is an album that's meant to be danced rather than played. Every song is its own drum. Put the parts together and the result is a wriggling giant of motivation, persuading each muscle to jump in time with the music. At the same time, lead singer Dave Gahan was doing his best to separate himself from disco, saying, quote, we never really aimed for our music to be fashionable dance music. We're not telling people what to do or what to wear. The album song Nodisco captures this contradiction well. Theoretically railing against the shallowness and superficiality of disco culture, the song nevertheless uses Patrick Cowley's disco gallop with the sheen of the slickest chic tune. So here's the Patrick Cowley. And here's Depeche Mode.
I saw you in the picture, I saw you play the part. This ain't no disco.
Counterculture and punk advocate Mick Farren wrote in early 1982 that, quote, in many respects, they backed themselves into a philosophical corner like that of the most mindless commercial disco, even though the intro to their No Disco received clenched fist salutes from what I assume were the remains of the disco fellates movement at the Ritz last Friday. But with Vince Clarke's bewildering mix of purely electronic sounds, Dave Gaughan's distant, unemotional vocal style, traditional pop structures, and a visual style indebted to both punk and gay clone culture, they were never going to win the battle against US rock critics, no matter how much they sang "This Ain't No Disco." Robert Christgau for Village Voice reviewed the album as a must to avoid, saying their songs cross disco artist, quote, Miko without the humble functionalism, Gary Newman without the devotion to service, and Kraftwerk without the humor, oh, definitely without the humor. A year later, synth wizard Vince Clarke's next project, Yazoo with Alison Moyet, shifted its critique from disco to punk in the song Goodbye 1970s, which we are not going to listen to for. There we go. But sorry, it needs no explanation. We're moving out of the clone era. While straight America had always looked at clone culture with a mix of fear and humor, think Cruising on the one hand and Police Academy's, what was it, Blue Oyster Bar? Was that what it was called? By the early 1980s, fatigue with both the clone and disco made them the objects of parody from within gay communities as well. One of the best examples of this, Castro Boy, was a self-released dance single by DJs Lester Temple and producer Barry Bean. A parody of the ubiquitous Frank and Moon Zappa hit, it turned Valley Girl into a high-energy dance anthem. Castro Boy remains faithful to the original's chord changes and structure, but the buzzy electric bass and rock guitars and drums are replaced by the Prophet 5 and Pro 1 synthesizers, and the relentless four-on-the-floor pounding of the Linn drum. Their stand-up gay comedian friend Danny Williams was invited to provide the stereotypical Castro Boy dialogue, and in one take he managed to capture all four of the clone culture's D's.
Castro Street is so hot. I mean, so many men, so little time. It's not pretty being easy. I mean, you can cruise for days, girl. From the Badlands to Castro Station over to Moby Dick's. Check out the new wave clones at Bear Hollow. It's to die for. It's so fabulous.
Down on Castro, there he goes. He just bought some fancy clothes. Hanky on the left and Keys on the right. He is such a man inside. Castro Boy, he's a Castro Boy. Castro Boy, he's a Castro Boy.
So, my friend Bill calls. Oh no, we're not lovers. We're like, sisters. And anyway, he says, come on, girl, let's go dancing tonight. We always go to the Troc, but tonight I was into the beam. You got any crystal? So all he has is NBA. This stuff makes you horny? Woo, for days. So like he goes, I just got the new Viola Wills record. I mean, please, he's such a disco dolly. David Bowie, he's so cool. Modern music. Oh, is he gay? Ooh, I like this song. It really pees. Ooh, let me get a hit off these poppers. Woo! Yay, new Sylvester Wicked Girl. Do you wanna fuck? Well,
The record was an immediate hit on gay dance floors around the country. It may be difficult to understand how such a cheap and cheerful song made such an impact, including a nomination for Outstanding Contribution by a Recording Artist at the 1983 Cable Car Awards. But the track provides for the historian a snapshot of an ideal clone night out in the early 1980s. On the surface, silly, carefree, and frivolous, but built on the struggles of those DJs, musicians, and dancers that made cities like San Francisco a destination for their liberation. My final example from a critique from within came in 1980 from two members of the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus, Carl Brown and Matthew McQueen, who'd grown tired of the gay chorus's conservative gay Republican wing and this general stifling conformity of life in the Castro. To critique gay culture from the inside, they formed the band Automatic Pilot, a name derived from the courtroom psychiatric defense of Harvey Milk's murderer, Dan White. If you remember, he said he went on automatic pilot when he ate the Twinkies. Keyboard player Carl Brown was a native Californian who had attended UC Santa Cruz as a music major, specializing in electronic music composition. When he graduated in '78, he moved to San Francisco to be gay. One of the first things he did was audition for the new Gay Men's Chorus, attending their first rehearsal in October '78. A month later, Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone were assassinated by Dan White, and the first performance of the chorus was on the steps of City Hall for an impromptu memorial performance. Brown never felt really comfortable in the culture of the Castro. Quote, "I had long hair and a beard. I was never a clone, and I was at the edge of that scene. I was not exactly an outcast. People weren't mean to me, but definitely I didn't really conform to the whole clone and disco scene." Singer Matthew McQueen, on the other hand, was a textbook example of one, at least if you judge by appearances. He also grew up in California in the rural Central Valley, but cut his musical teeth in his teen years playing folk music in LA coffee houses and clubs, all the while working for an escort service. Hollywood in the early '70s was eager to exploit a handsome 16-year-old, and before long he was making a good living as a sex worker. By the late 1970s, he was in San Francisco and began performing with artists in the city's queer avant-garde, such as Pristine Condition and other members of the performance art collective The Coquettes, in addition to more traditional gigs at gay Castro coffee houses. He joined the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus because he missed singing choral music and because the club engagements dried up as disco replaced other kinds of music in the gay scene. In the chorus, McQueen and Brown formed a close friendship despite their very different backgrounds. Brown remembers, "Matthew was real hot and he had lots of action and he definitely fit into the scene a lot better than I did." But they shared a love of weird rock music by people like Captain Beefheart, PDQ Bach, and Frank Zappa. Neither Brown nor McQueen felt much of a connection to the music that filled most gay spaces at the time. "I didn't really like dance music," McQueen recalls. "I never really was big on gay music, if that's considered gay music." They formed Automatic Pilot as a response to that. The first song they wrote together, Prelude to a Quaalude, was written as a spoof of the drug-fueled disco scene. And their satire of Castro life was more overt in the second song they wrote, Sit on My Face. Here's a review of Sit on My Face. This is so good. The choral selections were marvelous. Perry Georgia, "No One Loves a Fairy When She's 40" was very funny among other performers. However, there was one number I didn't think was in the best of taste, especially as there were several straights in the audience. It's a punk-type rock group called Automatic Pilot. They were talented for that genre, but one of their numbers was extremely tasteless. Their number was called Sit on My Face. Stealing the tagline, talented but extremely tasteless, from the review in their publicity flyers, soon they were performing in gay nightclubs around the Bay Area before small but appreciative audiences and for a broader audience at the Castro Street Fair. McQueen and Brown labeled their style of music erotic jazz wave, acknowledging its debt to jazz but embracing their punk new wave qualities as well. You can hear their song Clone Butt, which they premiered in April 1982, which acknowledges the disillusionment with disco culture's fantasy land of preening and vanity, the stand and pose culture of gay nightlife.
Will you make it to the dance? Will you make it to the dance? Will you find the perfect dance? Will you make it to the dance? Will you find the perfect dance? Will you act as if you're bored, poppers spilling on the floor? You tried so hard to look so bored, spilled your poppers on the floor. Spend all day getting pretty, push to pump the titty. Pump the titty, pump the titty, pump the titty. Spend all day getting pretty, push to pump the titty. Pump the titty, 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 pump the titty. Spend all day getting pretty. Push and bump the titty. Push and push to bump the titty. Trying hard to be a man. Getting that you're a fan. Getting that you're a fan. Clone but lips are tight. Clone but is never right. Clone but lips are tight. Clone but.
Tony Crematus who'd been singing with the group since their first public performance, urged the band to move in a more commercial direction, to remove the obviously gay elements for their song, and to tone down the jazzier what would be left, honestly. He offered to pay for professional studio time and to hire studio musicians, and Frank Zinkovich, bass player for Romeo Void. After several studio sessions at 3 different places, they were left with 6 commercial-sounding songs, not quite enough for an album. Some of the recordings from these sessions retain the group's glorious weirdness, but mostly one is left with the sense that their uniqueness is lost. Or as Carl Brown put it, they had turned into what it had originally parodied, dance rock. So here's an example of their new style.
I thought I was crazy, everything got hazy. She spoke with her eyes, her name was Tracy. She said something really strange. She said something I couldn't explain. Your luck is bad, can't find love. I know a secret. Your luck will change, love will come. I know a secret. Say on loose, say on loose.
By 1984, however, the relatively trivial concerns of disco culture were fading into irrelevance as the AIDS crisis took hold. Tony Kermatis died shortly after the studio sessions in '85, followed by most of the rest of the collective in that year, upending any plans they may have had to market their new material. McQueen and Brown survived and turned their energies to a new project, The AIDS Show, to which they contributed 3 songs alongside the musicologist Paul Attanello. Automatic Pilot combined satirical gay lyrics with an anarchic punk ethos that merits a reevaluation of the traditional narrative of queer pop music, alongside those of other pioneering queer artists who didn't survive the 80s and 90s. The US lost its place as the center of dance music in the early 1980s with the loss of pretty much all the key players to AIDS within the first 5 years of the epidemic. Patrick Cowley was the first to die, among the first in the country, in fact. By 1984, Moby Dick Records had gone out of business after only 3 years. 7 of its 10 core employees had died. Megatone managed to squeak through on a much smaller scale until owner Marty Bleckman's AIDS-related death in 1991. With their loss, British musicians largely replaced American music on the US dance floor until AIDS caught up with Europe as well. Pet Shop Boys, Erasure, Dead or Alive, and dozens of other UK and European queer electronic dance acts uniquely achieved mainstream success using the language of post-disco, only now simply coded as queer. Looking back at those British gay artists, living in an 80s environment where there was no opportunity and certainly very little appetite for an openly gay musical style in the clubs, it makes you appreciate that brief moment when dance music meant queerness. In the words of a lesbian activist of the time, quote, "I've always wondered what all those silly faggots were dancing, partying about. On my second dance floor of the evening, it hit me. The same energy release I felt at a good gay liberation demonstration, at a political rally, that's what I felt on the dance floor. It's a way of fighting back. Apolitical though it is, it does help us survive. It was our place." I remember moving to San Francisco in 1994 and being asked when interviewing for an apartment how long I had left. They wanted to find out when they would have to get a new roommate. It was the gay bars and dance clubs, punk, disco, new wave, Latin, that saved my life. Thank you. Should we talk? Sorry, that was like a million different directions. So this was the problem when talking about post-disco, right? Like the lives, many afterlives of disco.
What questions do folks
Hello, hi. This is, I guess, kind of on the borders of what you're talking about, but can you think of any tracks that were made perhaps with a mind to other tracks? You played like, I'm forgetting the track you played that sounded really similar to I Feel Love. I was wondering if anyone made tracks with in mind DJs will really like this song because it fits, it like slots into this other song very well. I don't.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, there's a track that I only know from DJ sets. It's not something that comes up in, like, I don't know, disco channels. Do you know what I mean? When you turn the channel, which is like the song Space Invaders. Who does Space Invaders? Does anybody know? Are there any free? Was it Yellow Magic Orchestra? Yeah, and it uses a lot of similar, and you're just like, oh, okay, I know what they're doing. And in the wake of I Feel Love, there are so many songs I'll just be listening to, and I'm like, oh, what year or when did this come out? Like 1 month after I Feel Love. Oh, I can see. Anything with that rhythm, definitely. I think one of the interesting things is, certainly in San Francisco, importing a lot of those records and then re-releasing them in a US context with new remixes, I think did some of that work too, like adding synthesizers, adding new sounds that were more current or that were emulating other kinds of tracks that were successful after Patrick Cowley, after his hits. I mean, everybody was imitating Patrick Cowley after Menergy and Megatron Man. Those sounds were pretty much everywhere, that Prophet 5 synthesizer.
Would you say you pioneers, you talk about like a galloping sound, which sounds.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. There'd be no Stock Aitken Waterman if it weren't for Patrick Cowley, without a doubt.
Thank you.
Sure. That's nothing against Stock Aitken Waterman, who I love. Absolutely.
Thanks for that. That was lovely. Thank you so much. If this is a bit beyond the bounds, I'm sorry, but we covered so many things. So, I'm curious, just on your opinion, really, where the kind of new to disco thing, and that kind of arty, is it rock, is it dance music that sort of comes out of New York, fits in with what we're talking about here, and kind of crosses those two boundaries.
Well, I think a lot of the stuff that Richard was talking about, the earlier stuff, fits in with that as well. The kind of merging of punk and electronic music that brings in elements of disco. I think there's so many comparisons and so many queer comparisons, especially when you think about, I've never known how to pronounce their name. Genesis P. Orage. Is that how they said their name?
Yeah.
Yeah, someone like that, sort of true avant-garde weirdos who were doing music that they didn't really care about commercial success. A fantastic New York artist, Sokaris, he had a band called Catholic that did, working with Patrick Cowley, and they did kind of a punk new wave disco hybrid in New York that could only have come out of New York, I think, at that time. But Patrick Cowley's doing very different things there because he's not creating a gallop, he's just adding weird sound effects and doing kind of more moody things. But yeah, I think the weirdo thing, that was your term, right? No, mutant. Mutant was your term, yeah. Yeah, who are you thinking of? Like which?
Well, like to an extent, I suppose, like Talking Heads kind of presuppose mutant disco a little bit, and then you get into like Kid Creole and What's That Was, and that kind of.
Yeah, the people who tend to get talked about as post-punk, and I think there is an argument to be made there, but also the fact that post-punk becomes so danceable makes you wonder what that term really means. What does it mean when you call something post-punk? I think there's a big difference between what Lou Reed is doing and what Talking Heads are doing, or even what Blondie's doing. So yeah, I think I did not answer your question. I don't know what it is, but yeah, sorry. I'm not very good at that.
Thank you.
I need to think about it. Thank you.
Did one was a good one.
No, it's a good one. Because I think maybe we could slot in Divine in there too, if we're thinking about making someone like Divine and Edith Massey as sort of New York superstars on both the punk and dance floors. What do you do with that? Are we making fun of them? Divine definitely seems in control if you think you're a man. Edith Massey, I'm not so sure in her punk band. And so, or other sort of random left, like Klaus Nomi. Where does someone like Nomi fit in who's using electronic music to sing you don't know me. Do you know what I mean? Doing a kind of new wave.
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, I just don't understand why any of that stuff kind of fits in, but it clearly does fit in somehow. So, I love this service.
Yeah, it fits in that Mud Club Danceteria world.
Yeah, the kind
You
of
know?
really weirdness.
There was none of that in San Francisco, and very little of it in LA. They were still a bunch of freaking hippies. Do you know what I mean? They were very happy.
That's my answer, yeah.
Yeah. They were into drag as long as you could still do lots of drugs. Do you know what I mean? And the drag was never pretty. It was always wonderfully messy and chaotic. And I think performance art, what was the Andy Warhol quote when the Cockettes performed in New York City? It's not enough to be terrible. No, it's not enough to have no talent. That's what he said. It's not enough to have no talent. And that's when Sylvester left, because he's like, these San Francisco hippies, they don't care about the show being good. Do you know what I mean? They just want to take a lot of acid. So Sylvester's like, I'm an artist. You know, I need to actually do art. So that's good.
You're gonna have to forgive me for this question. All right, I'm working on it, but it's relating Will's paper and the sense of impending doom that you seem to be arguing was coming in from the outside. I'm wondering if in the SF scene, through the mid to late 70s, were these really hilarious critiques and parodies of the Castro Clones, was there a sense from the inside of the scene of an impending end, of having passed a climax, or was that sense of impending doom, an inevitable end, only coming from the outside in?
No, it was from within, but I don't think it was a sense of impending doom. I think it was a reckoning even. I think it was more we should evaluate what our priorities are and make changes. You get a lot of defenses of clone life at the same time in the early 80s, all pre-AIDS. Sylvester had an amazing thing where he was like, I spend $60,000 a year on clothes, and I'm not going to wear 501s. He said, I tried it. I grew a mustache and I wore these jeans because he got dumped because his boyfriend said he was too femme. And so he's like, I'm going to become a clone. And I can't do this. This is ridiculous. Where are my rings? I need my diamonds and his borzois that he would have, his twin borzoi dogs that he would walk up and down. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thanks.
But the critique was of the racism. I'm sorry, the racism within clone culture, the sense of privilege, the sense of mindlessness, I guess. Things were becoming more political, and it was rather than getting rid of the clone identity, it was changing the clone identity to be less awful.
Yeah.
Sort of the way we can now watch Cruising and love it, whereas people protested it when the movie came, the movie Cruising when it came out, and now you watch it and you're like, those leather bar scenes are so hot. Now, from the distance of time, you're like, I want to go to that bar, I really do. But yeah.
Oh, do you have one?
I was just interested that there's this distinction that's been drawn that seems to have been made by rock journalists, and as you were talking between disco music and sort of contrasted against punk music, and the various criticisms that you detailed that they made of disco music in comparison to punk music. I was just trying to think that one through, because I was thinking about punk. And was it that punk was seen or viewed so much as in that way as being some sort of macho heterosexual sort of music? Because in England it didn't seem, my memory of it was not so much it being like that. I'm not sure if that's the point you were making, because I remember with bands like Buzzcocks and Wire, obviously, there's many other, it seemed integral and to the style and the of the music that it actually exactly wasn't that.
Yeah, and once you start getting to like, once you start integrating weird things like mod culture into punk
Yeah.
and two-tone influences and all these other things, it's a see, what the critics say is they're talking about American punk. So they're like, not the Ramones have no politics, they say, but then it goes over to that other place, and when it comes back, it's full of politics, and that's what the gay critics love. They love the fact that it has a what commitment to something, whatever that thing is. Where they're like, disco is nothing. Disco is just empty. It's completely empty meaning because they don't understand. It's not meant for the radio, for one thing. It's meant to be experienced on the floor, again, with the repetition idea. And punk in a 2-minute song can't create, it's a visceral, instant thing. Whereas to be put in the headspace of a long break, you know, you have to devote yourself to that. You have to give your brain over to that. They're very different kinds of musical experiences. And I think the rock critics just didn't know how to do that, didn't know how to think about that experience of experiencing this new kind of music. And I don't think it necessarily has to do with macho stuff either, necessarily, or the idea that it's homophobic, because most of the gay critics are like, they dismissed that. Well, they said disco people just as gave up their gay audience just as quickly as anybody else did. So we're not talking about loyalty to an audience necessarily. But I do have to think about that. It's a really good question.
Is that rushing you? Thank you for that talk. It was fantastic. And it was great to see you kind of triangulate punk, disco, and funk and its critics into a single talk. It was really helpful for me. It also it provoked some questions in my mind. I mean, the first thought, I'll have a thought and then I'll have a question about it. The first thought is I was kind of surprised that Vincent was used as a figure for endorsing a teleological form of song, because, you know, in my talk, I position him as somebody who's saying repetition is an Africanism that reappears in funk, and that's something that needs to be understood as a you know, a Black cultural element that is about the traffic between, you know, Africa and the U.S. ultimately.
And here he's defending traditional song structures.
Right. So this is like an you know, maybe in the same book he works himself into some kind of contradiction there. But then you make an interesting argument there, and to position your own work against his, that in disco repetition takes on a specific kind of queer function on the dance floor. And there's something about the way that the group works there, you know, which is you know, group by its own nature is kind of, it's repetitive and non-teleological, like you said, in James Brown, can go on for so long, which is why I think this is usually somebody endorsing that.
Yeah.
But where he's making the connection with Black diaspora, you're making that connection with kind of a queer function on the dance floor. And I would like if you can just repeat to me or clarify what that function is and why that becomes a queer rather than a necessarily Black element.
It should have been the whole talk, honestly. Do you know what I mean? And I was agonizing over and over again, how do I stop this discussion? Because I think it goes into Detroit techno very easily, this trajectory, and then into certain kinds of really gay house. You know, during the AIDS years, the big AIDS years, I think the way house functions as this very stripped down kind of minimal, who is it that had that great quote about minimal, about describing house as being minimal and stripped down? It was really, really effective. What I would do is I'd say the intersection, it has to be an intersection of certain kinds of party drugs that were encouraged in those queer spaces that you don't necessarily find in the straight spaces, that encourage the DJs to, and the duration of the parties. We're talking till, 10, 11 in the morning kind of parties in the 70s. Those two things combined with the idea, certainly on the West Coast, of being connected to the counterculture and those Eastern ideas of trance and sort of meditation and those kinds of ideas that find their way into so many different queer performance artists and queer kind of thinking in that time and from the 60s. And I think we don't necessarily have that in other places necessarily, but I do see a trajectory to New Age culture, connecting New Age culture, New Age music, the use of electronics, all of those things in this new queer way, which is about creating stasis. Movement through stasis, through meditation, through altered mental states on the dance floor. Maybe it's this idea of, it's an anti-frivolity, but it's yet really frivolous in a way. It's like gay men are going to go out and get completely wrecked. And this is how you do it for 12 hours. You hear that version of I Feel Love that you couldn't get away with playing in a straight club. You know what I mean? Because gay men in particular are particularly primed to be in that headspace and to experience in that way. I'm still wrestling with this, trying to come up with why I think is it only queer artists doing it? Because it is very different than Cerrone, very different than Giorgio Moroder, and pretty much any other electronic artist I can think of at the time, what these gay DJs in particular are trying to do. Do you have any ideas? We can talk about it later, but yeah.
No, it just has me, I'm trying to think about, formal elements of certain genres and their kind of wider cultural significance. And I don't know, I think you're onto something.
I think it's different than what James Brown was doing, though.
Yeah,
I think
it
the Black Dance with the sort of West African influence started it off. But I think Bobby Vidarini is doing something different. He's not trying to create sort of West African rhythms necessarily. He's trying to create psychedelic feelings, and that's not what James Brown was interested in doing. So there is a difference, I think. But it starts, of course, with James Brown, like so many things in our dance music cultures.
Do we have any last questions before we close? Well, then I want to thank you, Louis Niebur, for being here with us and for sharing your research. Thank you. So folks, we break now for our disco naps. Everybody go have your disco nap and your dinner. We're gonna meet up for the last time at 7:30 at the Stannery Bar again. Douglas Noble and Georgie Brendan are gonna be DJing, and then after that, DJ Luis Mario Oriana Rizzo is gonna play us out. So if you can, come through so we can all exchange contact information and figure out sort of where do we go from here. Maybe we want to stay in touch and do this again or connect in some kind of way. So hopefully I'll see most of you at 7:30 at the Stannery. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christine.
That's brilliant.
I'll see you in a bit.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.